the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. We are proclaiming liberty one show at a time, and the next one starts right now. What's up? How's it going, everybody? Clint Armitage, the Liberty Podcast. We're into part 3 now of the Dark Ages of America. Yeah, it looks like we're going to do more episodes on this just because it's so involved, and it talks about some things that we're seeing in America now that kind of parallels what Israel went through, and to show the progression of wickedness that the nation of Israel had at that time. And what God did was split the nation. He split the nation in two. And so that's kind of what we're seeing here. We talked about in the last episode. We're seeing that in America now. And there's some things that happen, and again, we'll talk about the progression. We talked about it a little bit, so we got the first stage was kind of the stage where it was one nation under God in Israel. They had the monarchies, right, with King Saul, King David, then King Solomon, and then the Lord split the nation into two after Solomon because of wickedness throughout the nation. And then we get to Jeroboam, which is the second stage prior to the Dark Ages, although it is starting to get dark now with Jeroboam, because he's going to open up and really start to push the idolatry. Okay, he's pushing the nation, he's leading the nation into sin, into wickedness, and it revolves a lot around idolatry, which a lot of sins stem from there. But that's where we're at in our study here. And so Jeroboam's leading this. Again, this is the second stage of the Dark Ages. And then we have the third stage, which is going to kind of come in here with Ahab, and we'll talk about that as well. But so let's finish up what we have here with Jeroboam. So the last episode, we mentioned that Jeroboam was leading the people into sin through idolatry, and he basically set up two places for people to worship in Bethel and Dan, so they didn't have to go down to Jerusalem, didn't have to go down to the temple and worship, because he didn't want them to leave. He wanted to control them. So he set up things for people to do worship in the northern kingdom there. And additionally, what he did was he created new gods, new idols for them to worship too. So he made it easier, convenient, and then he also introduced something else that the people were led to. And again, people will be led, especially if they're not grounded and founded in the Lord God. They will be led astray easily, and this leader did it. And we're seeing the same things happening in this country. Leaders are leading people into wickedness and into idolatry and into these other things that stem from idolatry. And then now we're starting to see the clouds darken here, because we're starting to move into the Dark Ages of America. Okay? All right, so we got Jeroboam. He sets up these two places for people to worship. He's leading people astray. And then now the Lord is getting upset at him. In 1 Kings chapter 13, the Lord actually sends a prophet to him to prophesy against him and say, the altars that he's created. The Lord basically sent this prophet to tell Jeroboam, hey, you are not doing good. So it starts in chapter 13, again in 1 Kings. So let's start in verse 1. Here we go. By the word of the Lord, a man of God came from Judah to Bethel. As Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make an offering, he cried out against the altar by the word of the Lord. O altar, altar, this is what the Lord says, a son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. On you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who now make offerings here, and human bones will be burned on you. That same day the man of God gave a sign. This is the sign that the Lord has declared. The altar will be split apart, and the ashes on it will be poured out. So that's verse 3. So you see, we have Jeroboam getting this prophecy against him and his idol worship just before he starts to worship this other god that he created and that he's led the other people astray with. Then a prophet stands up and pronounces judgment against Jeroboam. All right, verse 4. When King Jeroboam heard that the man of God cried out against the altar at Bethel, he stretched out his hand from the altar and said, "Seize him." But the hand he stretched out toward the man shriveled up, so that he could not pull it back. Also, the altar was split apart, and its ashes poured out according to the sign given by the man of God by the word of the Lord. Okay, so this prophet comes out. He pronounces judgment from God onto Jeroboam. Jeroboam gets upset. He goes to point to him and say, seize that guy, because he's going to kill him for standing up against him during this altar worship here, this sinful idol worship. When he does that, God shrivels up Jeroboam's hand. And later on, you see that he asks the man of God to ask the Lord to pray for him, to get the Lord to kind of restore his hand. And so the man of God does it. He intercedes with the Lord, and then the king's hand is restored. So that's that portion on that we're going to get into on chapter 13. Since we're talking about Jeroboam, we're going to move on from that and get on to chapter 14 in 1 Kings, because what happens is now Ahijah prophesies against Jeroboam. So just like this other man of God that prophesied against him because of the idol worship, now Ahijah's prophesying against Jeroboam because the Lord is not happy with this guy. This guy is totally leading the people astray. He's being very liberal with this idea that you can just worship any god, you can make up your own god, you can do whatever you want. And the gods that he's really getting them to worship as they start to permeate, it's going to be, the gods of Canaan. There's going to be Baal, it's going to be Ashtoreth, and these gods are the gods of fertility and, of produce. So they really connect to a few things here, a couple things here. Those idols are basically the god of sensuality or sex, and then of also like prosperity. So what if you look at America today, what's going on? That's what we worship too here in America. As Americans, we're worshiping the god of sex and the god of production or prosperity. It's money and sex, and that's where our leaders are starting to lead us to. That's what's happening. And this is the same thing that was happening back then, and it started with Jeroboam as the guy that really led this thing. Okay, so now we go back to 1 Kings chapter 14. We have Ahijah, who is the guy that gave the original prophecy to Jeroboam about being king. He's the one that had the new cloak, tore it into pieces, and said that he was going to take over 10 tribes. Now Ahijah's back on the scene, but now Ahijah's really old. Okay, so let's start in chapter 14, verse 1. At that time, Abijah, son of Jeroboam, became ill, and Jeroboam said to his wife, "Go, disguise yourself so you won't be recognized as the wife of Jeroboam. Then go to Shiloh. Ahijah, the prophet, is there, the one who told me I would be king over this people. Take 10 loaves of bread with you, some cakes, and a jar of honey, and go to him. He will tell you what will happen to the boy." So Jeroboam's wife did what he said and went to Ahijah's house in Shiloh. And so it goes on. That's the end of verse 4 there. And it goes on. She's disguising herself. So Jeroboam's son is ill. He's sick. And Jeroboam wants to find out what the word is from Ahijah because he knows that he's a prophet of God and he told him that he would be king. So sending his wife, obviously he wants to be low key. He doesn't want anyone to find out. And he doesn't even want Ahijah to know. So he's sending his wife disguised. Little does she know, God's going to tell Ahijah that she's coming and who she is. And so we get to the next verse here in verse 6. Let's talk about that. So when Ahijah heard the sound of her footsteps at the door, he said, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why this pretense? I have been sent to you with bad news." So now Ahijah's saying, "Hey, I got bad news for you and Jeroboam about your son." And he's going to get into it right now. "Go, tell Jeroboam that this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I raised you up from among the people and made you a leader over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. But you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commands and followed me with all his heart, doing only what was right in my eyes. You have done more evil than all who lived before you. You have made of yourself other gods, idols made from metal. You have provoked me to anger and thrust me behind your back." So see, this is what's going on. And we had mentioned it earlier. Jeroboam, up until that point, has done more evil than everybody who was before him. Again, he is the precipice. He is the one that is turning the people's hearts away from God. He's leading this, and he's leading them with idols. And that's what the Lord has basically told him right now through the prophet Ahijah. Well, he told his wife, and the wife is going to bring that back. But this is what's going on. God is not happy with Jeroboam. And in verse 10 it says, "Because of this, I'm going to bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off from Jerusalem every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will burn up the house of Jeroboam as one burns dung until it is all gone. Dogs will eat those belonging to Jeroboam who die in the city. and the birds of the air will feed on those who die in the country. The Lord has spoken. Whoa. So God's getting pretty harsh here because Jeroboam, even though he was given this opportunity by God, and God said, I will bless you. All you have to do is follow me in that original prophecy. And he just went totally sideways, 180 degrees away from God, and he starts doing all this idol worship. And now God is telling him he is basically going to get cut off. His whole line, all the males are going to be cut off in Israel, slave or free. He's going to burn his house, and just like, someone burns dung, and then dogs are going to eat the people belonging to Jeroboam who die in the city. So dogs are going to eat the people in the city, and the birds of the air will feed on those who die in the country. So all his line, his relatives, his people, the one that comes from him will die, and when they're going to die, and they're not going to be buried. They're going to be eaten by dogs if they live in the city, and they're going to be eaten by birds of the air if they live in the country where they die. So God is not being nice to this guy now, okay, because of the blatant wickedness and putting what God said, putting me behind you. So now Ahijah says to Jeroboam's wife in verse 12, as for you, go back home. When you set foot in your city, the boy will die. All Israel will mourn for him and bury him. He's the only one belonging to Jeroboam who will be buried, because he is the only one in the house of Jeroboam in whom the Lord, the God of Israel, has found anything good. Well, there you go. He tells her what's going to happen to the boy, because that's why Jeroboam sent his wife to Ahijah, was to find out if he can help the boy because he was sick. Well, she finds out this is what God says. The boy is going to die. As soon as she sets foot into the city, the boy's going to die. But listen to the mercy of God. Even through all this wickedness, through the wickedness of Jeroboam and what he has brought upon himself, God's going to, his whole house is going to be wiped out, right? God's going to wipe out his whole house. But look at the mercy that he has. He said, all Israel will mourn for this boy, right? And bury him. So he is the one that's going to be buried, the only one in Jeroboam's house. And it's because he's the only one that God found anything good in, this little boy. So there's mercy. God is being merciful to this little boy. So a couple different ways it looks like. It looks like he's being merciful to him. He has honor. The boy does die, but he dies not because of his wickedness. I don't know. Maybe the Lord took him so that he wouldn't have to grow up in this and be part of this curse that the Lord is putting on Jeroboam's house, where everybody's going to die and not be buried. They're going to be eaten by dogs or eaten by birds. And so the Lord is being merciful and pulling Jeroboam's son out of that and taking him early so that he actually can be buried. It's because he was the only one that was found anything good in the house of Jeroboam. So God is being merciful there. So, losing a child, maybe it's part of God's plan to be merciful. There's comfort in that, knowing that God is taking the child, that God is in control, and that God is loving and merciful so that this boy doesn't grow up in the circumstance and be part of this curse that's happening to everybody else in the house of Jeroboam. And he's being merciful and taking him up because that's the only one he found good in, and understand that God's in control. And yeah, it's tough to lose a child, but God is loving, God is caring, and he shows it here, even with Jeroboam, who is super, super wicked. So with the split, we have multiple kings. We have the kings of Israel now, and we have the kings of Judah now. And there is differences. And so we're going to take a look at all the different kings, and we're going to get to the third stage, which is Ahab. King Ahab's going to bring in the Dark Ages. This is where the nations, well, mostly the northern kingdom, but the southern kingdom eventually goes awry as well. They may last a little longer. They may not have as bad kings as the northern kingdom. They're not as liberal as the northern kingdom. They're more conservative, but they eventually go down that route as well. And so I'm going to go through the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, and kind of give you just a quick thing on what kind of king they were. And there was multiple kings. And now I'll talk about the kings that pass Ahab and all that. Then I'll go back to explaining the third stage with Ahab. All right. So let's see here. What do we got? Okay. So the kings of Israel, we have Jeroboam. Obviously, this is the one where the split happens. Jeroboam, he was a rebellious king. You saw he brought in idol worship. He was the one that started it off bad and leading the people astray. After him, you have King Nadab, and he wasn't a good king either. He was pretty bad too. And then you have King Baasha, who is wicked. Okay, Israel's not doing good. The northern kingdom is not doing good. And then the next king, Elah, was evil. another bad king. Zimri, the king after Elah, was sinful. He was not good either. Then Tibni, who was the next king, was wicked. So Israel's track record here is horrible. We've got bad to worse, and staying consistently bad. And now we're at the next king, which is Omri. Omri is super bad as well. He's not getting any better. No one's getting better here in the northern kingdom. And then we have, after Omri, we have Ahab. And again, we'll talk about Ahab. We'll probably have to talk about Ahab in the next episode, but Ahab becomes the worst king of the northern kingdom, the worst king up until that point. He is the start of the Dark Ages, okay, in Israel. And that's what we're going to have here in America, I believe. I believe we're going to have something like that, and there's going to be a third stage that opens up that starts this Dark Ages of America, and it's going to be someone like Ahab to start it. So again, Ahab was the worst up until that point, and they had bad kings throughout Israel. From the beginning of the northern kingdom, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kings until Omri, and then the 8th king, Ahab. And remember what I talked about in a previous episode about the number 8. The number 8 is the number of beginnings or new beginnings. And so Ahab is the new beginning. He's the beginning of the Dark Ages of Israel. He is starting the Dark Ages of Israel, okay? The 8th king there. Okay, so we're going to stop right there, and we're going to add another episode here, so it'd be part 4 coming up next time. So thanks for coming by, and I appreciate you listening, and don't forget to tune in for part 4 next time. Until then, stay safe, stay motivated, and keep seeking liberty. Joining us for another episode of the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@clintarmitage.com.